So the next, I guess, aspect or strategy of pride that I want to look at is the idea of moral righteousness. Now, recap: grandiosity. It's blinding us to our limitations, right? It's inflating the self-image. It's, oh, we can do all this and all that, and we're so great, or I'm so great. Vanity is wanting other people to see how great we are. And then moral righteousness is essentially those two, but more specifically in regards to our ethical, our high ethical standing, right? Where we come to believe that we have a clear sense of what is good and what is bad. And we can see all the evils of everyone else, and we can see almost ourselves as these prophets who are here to save the lives of all these fallen folk who don't understand how to be as good as we do. And I think a really good example of this is the story of Maximilien Robespierre. So for the idea of moral righteousness, I think Maximilien Robespierre is a fantastic example. And there's a book that I've just started reading called Fatal Purity, so I can learn about him more in depth. But I've got an idea of what's going on with Mr. Robespierre here. And essentially, the idea is that he became so engrossed with altruism, somewhat naivety, because he was naive to the evil that he was capable of. And he mistook his idea of the good for the good itself. And I think that's those ideas are at the root of moral righteousness. And essentially, here's what happens: as a youngin, and in his early life, he was literally known for being a moral, good person. They in fact had nicknames for him, like the one who could do no wrong, which is quite ironic in the long run. And he was very outspoken against things such as the death penalty. And along comes the French Revolution, and he ends up becoming a more extreme democratic French revolutionary. And he essentially wants to create a utopian society as a result of the French Revolution and of deposing the nobility. But when you start pursuing this idea of the utopian society, all sacrifices become necessary. And his fall begins when he says, "The king must die so that the country can live." And this is the first time he puts someone to death, and the king is executed. He's beheaded. It was King Louis. Pretty sure it's the 16th. King Louis gets freaking beheaded because Robespierre goes against his strong belief against the death penalty. And this isn't so much to say whether or not the death penalty is good or bad. That's a political discussion for elsewhere. But it is to say that he clearly took a step beyond what he saw as morally good, morally evil, and he took that step beyond it for the sake of pursuing what he saw as the ultimate good. And so there's this clear virtue or this clear ethic that he believes in, and he sacrifices that ethic. He sacrifices his ideal for the pursuit of his idea of the good. Or I wouldn't say he sacrifices his ideal. He sacrifices his values for the pursuit of his idea of the good. And he begins to gain power, and he's extremely vocal about bringing equality to all and justice and the most moral and ethical virtues that a society can embody, and he justifies all of his actions with these virtuous arguments. But he rarely addresses practicality. And as he goes about trying to bring about perfect equality and perfect justice and perfect freedom and fairness, he has to create an authoritarian regime in which people actually started turning in their neighbors just for suspecting that they might be against what Robespierre was doing. And this sets off what's called the Reign of Terror, where Robespierre is single-handedly responsible for beheading more than 17,000 people, which is, absolutely ridiculous. And he became what he despised in the pursuit of creating a better world. And it starts with that first sacrifice of virtue. And it wasn't that he had some experience that made him less naive, or to think that he shouldn't go against, or that the death sentence was a reasonable thing to do. It was that it became a matter of his simple ethics were not worthy of his perfect ideal, and that anything was worth it in order to bring about his ideal. And so he goes on, and he ends up creating what he calls the cult of reason. He's attempting to create the perfect religion, which I think is a very fascinating, and certainly says something about the overvaluing of rationality alone. So that's interesting. And then eventually he has this whole ceremony in which he descends from a papier-mâché mountain dressed in extravagant, and here comes again, Roman robes. And so, of course, symbolism reflective of Rome often is a result of pride. And I think it's possible to use that kind of symbolism, like in the way that maybe Pericles or other wise political figures might use it in order to inflate their public image, in order to gather support. But again, the problem comes when you mistake that for your true nature. But Roman symbolism, very, very tied in with pride. But this is a kind of vanity and an example of the kind of vanity that does not manifest your inflated self-image in the minds of others well. In the case of Alcibiades and of Napoleon, they were able to inflate their public image and people admired and then feared and envied them. In this case, people just lost respect for him, and this is when people realized he was kind of gone off the deep end, that he was completely crazy. He saw himself as a god, and eventually ended up well, they ended up beheading him, but before they beheaded him, he attempted to commit suicide and blew his own jaw off with it, which is which is pretty crazy, and failed at killing himself, and so he got beheaded with like half a jaw. So that's pretty gnarly. Quite the fault he had. But yeah, that's Robespierre and fatal purity. Okay. This story essentially illustrates this idea of moral righteousness in showing how somebody who is essentially altruistic, it's the sin of the altruistic, or it's the altruistic sin, if you will, where people have this deep desire to create a better world, right? Who are extremely empathetic and want to better the lives of all these people, can be driven to do incredibly terrible things, right? I mean, he started the reign of terror in the name of equality and freedom, which, like, all right, man, like, great. But moral righteousness essentially blinds us to the damage that we're doing to the world in our pursuits of good, or in our desire to do good. And I think there's a very common misconception in human nature, and I definitely see this in society today, which is that we think that the desire to do good alone is enough to do good, and we think like, okay, if we follow this pursuit because it's grounded on empathy, and it's grounded on this want to help all these people, that then we'll get that result. But that's not necessarily true. This is often known, or there's an idea similar to this that can be used to illustrate this idea known as the cobra effect. And essentially the idea came from the story from, I think it was ancient Egypt, where they had a cobra problem. There were cobras all over the place, and the government was like, all right, we'll pay you some amount of money, right, to turn in a cobra head. And then problem solved. Everyone's like going out searching for cobras to kill. But the problem is that a bunch of people just started breeding cobras and then chopping off their heads and then going in and turning in these cobras that they bred in like a little, I don't know, the house. I don't know where you breed cobras, in a tank. And eventually the government caught on to this. They're like, ah, shit, well, that didn't solve our problem. It actually made it worse, because sometimes the cobras would get out and about. Like, whatever. We got more. Let's keep producing them. And so there are a couple of consequences to trying to make changes or do things or accomplish things or act purely on the basis of goodwill. And the first, as we've discussed, is good intentions don't necessarily breed good actions. There's a degree of knowledge, of considerations, of thought that needs to be put into this. The second is that it's easy to stimulate feelings of enlightenment, and enlightenment is almost like an intellectual pride, right? And we could categorize that as an effect of its own. But when we're consumed with this sense of enlightenment, we become closed off to other information that may prove that our well-intended pursuit will breed bad consequences. And then in altruism being a part of our self-image, we blind ourselves to the damages that we're doing to other people, the real effects of our pursuits, or we justify it in some cases. Then those who try to stop us from these pursuits, we since we're good and they're trying to stop us from our good pursuit, from manifesting our good intentions, then they must be evil. And so it starts to cause us to easily label others as the villains that must be overcome. And then in this, other morals will start to drop in value in that hierarchy. And we can often justify these away with the idea that the ends justify the means, which isn't entirely wrong in some cases, because sometimes the ends do justify the means, but sometimes they don't, and that's an extremely complicated question. And moral righteousness simplifies that question to a degree that shouldn't be simplified. There's a verse in the Bible, Matthew 7:3-5, which says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." So there are a couple of ideas in here. First off is obviously the moral righteous aspect, in which we believe that we're capable of helping our friend or our brother or other people with their problems before we have actually dealt with our own problems. But there is a threshold which we can cross when we've dealt with our problems well enough, or to such a degree that we can actually go out into the world and help solve the problems of others. And I think the problem with pride is that pride will, or especially moral righteousness or self-righteousness, will cause us to think that we've crossed that threshold long before we actually have. And then by believing that, and by going out and and trying to help the world before we've dealt with the plank in our own eye will do more harm than good. So it's really important to be able to figure out how to recognize when you've actually crossed that threshold, and overcoming pride is going to be a good way to do that. But Jordan Peterson said something that I saw recently that seems to be a good solution for this, which is that whenever you go about attempting to better the world or help other people, start by trying to do the least damage possible and assume that anything you're going to do is going to be damaging. But if you're trying to minimize that damage, then eventually you'll figure out where you're wrong and start moving towards being a positive influence. This can also be done in a more interpersonal way, where I've seen a lot of times where there are people who are struggling in life in this way or that way, and somebody comes along and they see them struggling, and maybe they're friends, and the let's call them, let's say there's Bob and Dan, right? And Bob he's a very self-righteous individual, for example, and he believes he has a clear understanding of what needs to be done to live a good life, and he has a clear understanding of what that good life is, and he sees this suffering in somebody else. He thinks, I need to help them live a better life because I'm living a better life, and I want to be a good person and do that. And that's not a bad thing to want. But in this, they then kind of think, okay, I'm gonna get them on this better path, and they go and they try to make all these changes. But because of that prideful aspect, they're blind to the complexities involved in making such a change. And so, for example, they may think that what they did to better themselves will transfer onto this other person. They say, oh, you gotta go do this and do that. Another person may say, like, nah, like, that's not gonna work. And they're like, well, you're just stupid. Or the other person will listen. It's called, say, Dan will, like, listen. They're like, oh, yeah, you know what, you're right, I do need to do that. But since Bob did this without deep examination and consideration, without that humility required to effectively help somebody better themselves, it'll be ineffective and cause Dan to kind of spiral off on his own. Another really, really important thing to be aware of with self-righteousness is the repression, the denial itself of our more evil qualities and our more evil drives. And evil, of course, is being used in a fairly abstract sense, not like Voldemort evil, but just kind of like a, it becomes harder to admit when we act out of greed, or when we act out of envy, or when we're angry with somebody and we lash out at them. Instead of realizing, like, oh, I'm a flawed human being, I lashed out at them because I grew angry and I shouldn't have. Since altruism and righteousness is a part of our self-image, since being a good human being and being moral is a part of that self-image, we deny the possibility that was done unethically, that we maybe shouldn't have done that, and maybe they were right in some cases, and we repress those realities. So then our anger is then rationally justified instead of not there. Or when we act out of envy, instead of recognizing, okay, maybe I'm like envious of this person for this reason, that reason, that's why I feel like, ruining their life. Instead, it becomes directed at them, and it's, okay, well, they're bad for this reason, and I'm good for this reason. I saw a show recently, and I won't give away any details for spoiler reasons, but basically there were these two scientists who discovered this new type of technology, right? And they wanted to implement this technology into their society because they saw it as having great potential to better the lives of both the poor class and the rich class. And in the society, there was a stark divide between the two. And so their dream was to create this technology that would help poor people do work more safe, more efficiently. It would make them more money, and the rich would profit off this too because it would influence national trade. And so in order to get their company off the ground, they had to appeal to the rich first, because the rich were the ones who would be able to give them opportunities. And they appealed to the rich, and they said, okay, we'll help you expand national trade with this technology if you give us these investments. And you fast forward a few years, and they've done this. But in order to do this, they had to essentially get involved in politics. And there's this one character who's very cautious. He's like, look, man, this technology is great, but it can be used it has destructive capabilities. And so we've got to take this slow. We've got to be patient. And they're like, no, if we're too patient, then, we're just putting off helping the poor class, and we're putting off, what's important. And so they race forward with their inventions, and some of this technology gets into the hands of the poor. And at this point, tensions were kind of rising, and politically, the council gets very concerned about the poor having this technology, and they're like, all right, we have to go and essentially move in a military strike on the poor to regain this technology, because they might use it against us, right? Because they're obviously pretty pissed for being poor. And there's a whole battle that breaks out, and then in some other lab experiment, one of the scientists helpers dies on accident. They're like, oh geez, man, there's just a war going on now. Somebody died while we're trying to invent this technology on such a freaking time constraint. Well, a lot of people died actually, and they're sitting together looking out at a waterfall or something after all this shit goes down, and one of them says, in our attempt to be great, we failed to do good. And I thought that story and that quote, especially at the end, really encapsulates the problem with moral righteousness, in that we attempt to invoke some great change that's driven by that desire to do good, but because we're so blinded to the bad that we're doing, we fail to do any real good to those immediately present, those in our immediate vicinity.